Dietary Therapies for Epilepsy, New Research and New Strategies. Dr. Tanner?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Ross, and thank you, Brianna, and the whole staff of the Epilepsy Foundation for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this Innovation Week and really privileged to be part of your team today. Let me see if I can share my PowerPoint. Okay, let me make sure. All right, how is this? Can you all, Ross, can you
Yep.
see the slides? Okay, perfect. All right. So again, thanks for this wonderful invitation. I'm going to talk about the ketogenic diet therapies in adults specifically and adolescents as well. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about innovation and sort of what is new with the ketogenic diet. As Brianna indicated, I'm the director of the Epilepsy Center at Mercy Health, and I'm also Associate Professor of Neurology at Michigan State University. These are my disclosures. And so, yeah, these are our learning objectives. We're going to try to identify who's a candidate for the epilepsy surgery, and for a ketogenic diet, and then briefly talk about what's new in research with ketogenic diets. So I always like to start by giving you a little bit of context of why is it that we use or what we needing to use the ketogenic diet. And so, why is it that we need other therapies in epilepsy, especially when we have all these medications that you can see in the screen, right? I mean, and I'm actually missing a few that have been recently approved by the FDA. And the answer is here, and this is comes from large epidemiological studies. The first one from a landmark paper that was published by Quantum Brody 2 decades ago. And this shows that the vast majority of patients, about 50% of patients, become seizure-free after the first trial, so after the first medication. And another 20 to 30%, 10 to 20% become seizure-free with the second agent. And we know that after that, only a small percentage of patients become seizure-free with successive trials, right? The result is that we know that about 30 to 40% of patients have uncontrolled seizures despite of the use of any of these medications. And so it is this group that we are really worried about, right? And it is in this group that once we run into this, that it's time to use another treatment modality. And so options are, of course, epilepsy surgery. And I know you've had the opportunity to discuss epilepsy surgery during this Innovation Week. We think that epilepsy surgery is probably one of the first things you need to consider if you have focal epilepsy. It shouldn't be the last resort, right? It should be something that you consider doing early, not only in the treatment, but in the life of a patient. But I'm not here to talk about epilepsy surgery. I'm just a huge advocate for it. If surgery is not an option, then patients can try other investigational or anti-epileptic agents. Definitely neurostimulation has gained a lot of attention with DBS, RNS, VNS, and other types of neurostimulation. And then, of course, dietary therapies, which is what I'm here to talk about. So I always like to talk a little bit about the history of the ketogenic diets, in part to give you a context in that this is really not a new therapy, but also for you to understand sort of the long road that we've traveled with ketogenic diets. And so there's actually writings about ketogenic diet dating to 400 years before Christ, where Hippocrates wrote that that complete abstinence from food and water was the adequate treatment for a person that had burns and seizures. Galen, 200 years later, also recommended abstinence from food and liquids for patients with seizures. There's a lot of other historical documentation of ketogenic diets, but in present, sort of like in the present era, the initial reports were by Dr. Hugh Conklin in the 1910s, where he documented, as you can see, there's this little blurb from a newspaper, that he fasted a patient for 22 days and the patient became seizure-free, which is wonderful, but of course, is obviously not a treatment that we can, consistently offer to anyone. So it was actually Dr. Russell Wilder I think he got really curious about this, that created this high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet to mimic the fasting state. Because of course, fasting indefinitely is not something that can be done. And he actually published the findings of that study in the Mayo Clinic Bulletin in 1921. So that's really the first publication that we have for the ketogenic diet. So we're, approaching 100 years doing this. So, what happened afterwards is that up until the 90s, the diet was actually not used a whole lot. It was used only in a few centers. It was really used as a last resort. There was actually not a whole lot of interest from the Epilepsy Society or Epilepsy Foundation. It was really perceived by many people like alternative medicine, right? And there were very few publications from very few centers, from very few countries, and it was actually rarely used in adults. That all changed in the early 90s when this little boy that you see in your screen, Charlie Abrams, showed up at Johns Hopkins. And specifically to see Dr. John Freeman. Dr. Freeman had been really interested in the ketogenic diet. Charlie was a boy that had already failed epilepsy surgery and was having hundreds of seizures per day. Dr. Freeman put him on a ketogenic diet, and within days, this boy was completely seizure-free. He is, to this day, still seizure-free. He's in his, I want to say, early 30s. He's actually, I think, a kindergarten teacher. And the reason why this is important is because Charlie's dad, Jim Abrams, was someone that was, first of all, a person of influence and affluence. He's the director of some wonderful films that I'm sure many of you have seen, like the Naked Gun series and Airplane. So he was in a position of I would say, influence. But most importantly, he was really frustrated that no one had talked to him about the diet before. And so he spearheaded the Charlie Foundation, which really became a catalyzer from research in the ketogenic diet world. They've really not only spread the word about the diet, but also raised enormous amount of funds for ketogenic diet therapies research. They've organized the first meetings for ketogenic diet. We have a global meeting every other year. It was supposed to be this year in England, but of course, given the current circumstances, it's been postponed till next year. But they've really made a difference in how the diet is perceived. If you're ever interested, Jim Abrams directed this film, Do Not Harm. It's loosely based in the history of Charlie. If you ever have a chance to watch it, it's a wonderful film. Also, if you have a chance, go to the Charlie Foundation's website. There's all kinds of resources, information, there's videos, there's recipes, there's really a wonderful place for information. The picture that you see with Meryl Streep and Jim Abrams' wife and the main dietitian, Beth Spank, was from one of the global meetings. So anyhow, that's sort of like the history, and I wanted to give you that context. So now let's move on for the diets. And before I tell you what is new with research, I want to refresh your memory, or for those of you that don't know about the diets, kind of give you an idea what diets are like. And so first of all, they're called ketogenic, and there's many types of diets, but what they all have in common is that they restrict carbohydrates, usually to under 60 grams per day. In doing so, you really trigger a gigantic metabolic change in your body, where most of us on a regular Western diet, we use glucose or sugar, right? Same thing as fuel. If you restrict these carbohydrates, then your body is forced to look for another source of fuel. And in the case of a ketogenic diet, that source will be fat, okay? Turns out our bodies are actually very good at that. Our livers are very efficient at that. And so what happens in these gigantic metabolic change is that the liver uses fat and turns it into fuel. And this fuel is in the form of ketone bodies, hence the name ketogenic, right? And there's 3 of them. We don't need to talk in a lot of detail, but they're called acetone, acetoacetate, and beta hydroxybutyrate, okay? So this is what all diets have in common. There are several types of ketogenic diet therapies. And I want to clarify this because Keto diets have become really mainstream, and I'm sure you've seen all kinds of things regarding keto, you know, in every magazine out there and in the internet and in Facebook groups. But really in terms of metabolic treatment for epilepsy and other conditions, we recognize these separate types of diets. So here on your screen, you have a standard American diet. For most of us, a large part of our calories, of our daily calories, are in the form of carbohydrates, some of protein, and sort of more or less in fat. If you consider or compare that with a classic ketogenic diet, the one that was used for years for children, I want you to compare these. In blue, you see fat, right? And so for these patients, about 95% of their calories, daily calories, will be exclusively from fat, with just a small amount of carbohydrates and then protein. Then you have a variation of these called the modified ketogenic diet, where you have maybe a little bit more carbs and protein, but still about over 85% of your calories will come from fat. Then we have a modified Atkins diet, which is the one used mostly by adults and adolescents. And I'll speak to more detail about this in a second, where you have still about 65% of your calories will come from fat and a little bit more protein, and then low glycemic and medium chain triglycerides. So again, for the classic ketogenic diet, again, more than 90% of your calories will come from fat. The ratio is 3:1 to 4:1. And when we talk about ketogenic diet therapies, we often talk about ratios. And so let me explain what that is. A ratio is the ratio of fat versus the amount of carbohydrates and protein combined, right? And so 4:1 would be 4 parts of fat for each part of carbs and protein combined. And again, the modified versions with 1:1 or 2:1 ratio. The classic ketogenic diet, as I indicated earlier, was initially initiated to mimic the state of fasting while maintaining adequate nutrition. This is a very restrictive diet. Patients have to weigh the food, almost to the gram. Everything has to be measured, weighted. It comes available as an enteral formula, meaning as a liquid that can be given if a patient has a G-tube. And historically, children and patients that are started in the diet are admitted to the hospital. They're fasted for 24 hours, and then the diet is initiated. Intense teaching goes through in the hospital. Some of that has changed. I'll talk about that later. Then the modified Atkins diet, again, is the one that we use more commonly for adults and for adolescents. Was created in 2003, also at Johns Hopkins. Specifically, it's attributed to Dr. Kossoff. And I have to tell you, the group at Hopkins they have been really pioneers in ketogenic diet therapies, and we still look to them in further guidance for ketogenic diets. If you've ever heard Dr. Kossoff speaks, he talks about how this diet came to exist. And he tells the story that he started seeing parents that came to him with children and admitting that they were not as judicious with the regular ketogenic diet. And they started telling him that, yeah, we're not as strict, we're measuring less, we're giving maybe a little bit more carbohydrates, but these children still responded very well to the diet. And so this is how we sort of came to be. So in a modified Atkins diet, patients receive about 10 to 20 grams of net carbohydrates. That kind of depends on weight, age, caloric needs. And a note here to tell you that net carbohydrates are total carbohydrates minus the fiber within each food that you consume. It still is a high fat diet, right? You still will consume 65% of your daily calories from fat, and it allows for moderate amount of protein. We tell the patients to look at all the food labels, to count for net carbohydrates. In this diet, we don't ask patients to weigh everything, but you still have to measure things. You still have portions. You still have to be somewhat judicious in looking at how much you're consuming. With this diet comes to be about a 2:1 ratio. So again, 2 parts of fat for every protein and carbohydrates, or a 1:1, depending on how we structure the diet for each patient. And by the way, this leads me to the next point, in that this is not a cookie cutter. In our center, where we run a very active ketogenic diet clinic, we see the patients individually. We spend, a good hour and a half for new patients, and we give patients a prescription. Just like you get a prescription for a medicine with, say, a titration, we do the exact same thing for the diet. Patients know exactly how many servings of fat, of protein, of carbohydrates they are to consume. It's not like a, same, a mold for everyone. Just for you to get an idea of what 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrates are, it's actually very little. If you think of a banana, that's 27 grams. So that usually will exceed the amount of carbohydrates you would consume per day. A red tomato is about 5 grams. Glass of milk, 8 grams, right? And so patients tell me, so you're telling me I cannot drink milk? Well, you could, but that's almost half of your carbs. So one of the things that we do is that we really educate patients on what they can and cannot consume, and what's the smart to consume, right? I mean, it would not be smart to just have a glass of milk and then, you're done with half of your carbohydrates. A delicious donut is 22 grams. Soda is almost 50. Slice of bread about 15, and so forth. And so I also want to point out that I always put fruit, because I think that's one of the things that is very difficult for patients to give up during the diet. Because fruit, unfortunately, fruits are delicious and natural, but at the end of the day, a lot of what a fruit becomes once it's in the system is in glucose. Fruit is somewhat limited in a modified Atkins diet. It's not zero, but if patients do well, we sometimes can factor in a little bit of fruit in the form of fruits that have a lot of fiber and less sugar, like berries and things like that. But very sugary fruits like a banana or watermelon, unfortunately, cannot be part of the diet. Then we have a low glycemic index treatment diet, and let me go back and show you where we compare is this one. So a low glycemic index is a little bit more liberal in the carbohydrates. We usually can allow patients to consume up to 40 to 60 grams of carbohydrates, but they are all of low glycemic index. And so a glycemic index, or the glycemic index, is a measure that ranks foods according to their effect on your blood sugar levels, okay? So the rates at which different foods raise blood sugar varies, right? If you consume a piece of candy, pure sugar, your blood sugar will spike fairly rapidly in your bloodstream. Whereas if you eat, say, 7-grain wheat bread, sugar will slightly rise. And so based on that, there are 3 glycemic index ratings. So low glycemic index are 55 or less, medium 56 to 69, and then high 70 or more, okay? So foods with a low GI value are the preferred choice in this diet, because they're slowly digested, slowly absorbed, and they cause a smaller and very slower peak, not a peak, but almost like not a really steep peak in your blood sugar. On the other hand, again, foods with a really high glycemic index, again, will have a really rapid increase in sugar. So they are limited in this diet. So just for comparison, low glycemic things would be to eating a whole orange. Why? Because the orange, there's a lot of fiber. While you chew, each piece of the orange is slowly absorbed. So the rise in sugar will be slow. Whereas if you drink orange juice, then that will provoke a really rapid increase in sugar. Brown rice versus white rice, same thing. Wheat or multi-grain bread versus white bread. Strawberries versus watermelon. Lentils, beans, quinoa, cheese, these are all low glycemic index foods. Things, of course, like, waffles, pancakes, kind of chips, candy, of course, would be of high glycemic index. And finally, another diet is the medium chain triglyceride. And let's go back to our chart. So medium chain triglyceride allows for, again, it's a little bit more liberal with carbohydrates and slightly more with protein, and still about 45–50% in fat, but it uses primarily the calories will come from medium chain triglyceride oils. And these oils tend to produce more ketosis than long chain triglycerides, which is what most of us eat in the rest of other fats. So it's more liberal in carbohydrates, it's more liberal in protein, and because of that, it's a little bit more palatable, right? So these are all the diets that we have available. We'll talk a little bit at the end of who's a candidate for what. And that's where you want to, self-refer or find an adequate ketogenic diet center where you can really explore with your epileptologist and a registered dietitian which of these is the best diet for yourself or for your child. All right, so because this is Innovation Week, now we're going to talk about research and what's new with the ketogenic diet. So what is new in research? I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanism of action of the diet, the expanded use in epilepsy, in brain tumor, in other neurological diseases, and a little bit in general, health and weight management and why this is important in epilepsy. So mechanism of action. So this is actually been evolving rapidly over the past decade and a half. And we really continue to advance our understanding of how the diet works. And so for many years, we thought that this was the mechanism of the diet, right? You go into ketosis and seizures decrease, right? I mean, super simple. Now we know that it looks more like this, right? And so we have all these, different mechanisms of action, but I'm going to point out a few things. Number one, we increase the number of ketone bodies, right? Hence, again, the name ketogenic. These are acetone, acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate. We increase the amount of energy that is produced during this metabolism through the Krebs cycle. Importantly, this compound called adenosine increases, and adenosine seems to be protective against seizures. So this is a really key element of the diet. Also, these three ketone bodies, specifically beta hydroxybutyrate, seem to be really, really good source of fuel for our neurons. Our neurons apparently, and especially the part of the neuron called the mitochondria, which is like the battery of the car, does much better with beta hydroxybutyrate. It's almost like putting the really fancy oil and really fancy high octane gasoline to your car. Other factors that influence the diet is decreasing glucose. If you are consuming very low carbohydrates, your glucose levels will tend to be on the lower end, but most importantly, they'll be fairly constant. And that seems to be protective against seizure. Because your glucose levels are low, also your insulin levels will tend to be relatively lower, and that seems to be important. Factors like reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress are important, and I'll talk about that later. We also know that the ketogenic diet therapies stimulate energy metabolism. So again, they almost make our neurons work better, function better, which is, why one of the reasons why patients on ketogenic diet therapies in general feel better. They feel more energetic, they feel more clear, cognition improves. But importantly, they also appear to inhibit things like toxicity mediated by glutamate, which is a substance that can increase your seizure burden or decrease your seizure threshold. They appear to increase GABA synthesis, and GABA is protective against seizure, decrease this free radical production, and that decreases inflammation, and it inhibits the mTOR pathway, which has to do, again, with the genesis of seizures. So I always spend a lot of time when I meet my patients in the ketogenic diet clinic talking about mechanisms of action, because for two reasons. One, so that we debunk this concept that this is some alternative treatment. This is a therapy. And it's an amazing thing to me, that thing that we can induce these changes just by changing the way we eat. These are changes similar to what we see when we introduce a medication or neurostimulation or neuromodulation, but we're doing it through a diet. And I mean, that to me is mind-blowing. And the other reason is because I tell patients, if you're going to do the diet, you need to do the diet, right? I mean, there's no cheating. Of course, we're human, you know, people fall off the wagon occasionally, but you know, if a patient is going to do the diet, they really have to commit to doing the diet, because we want to induce and maintain these changes. And so doing the diet for 2-3 days and then cheating for weekends, you know, really doesn't work that well, because then, you know, we eliminate these changes. Something that has been really big in innovation and in research in ketogenic diet therapies is the impact in the gut microbiota. And I'm sure you've all heard about this growing field of research, you know, the link between gut and brain. And turns out ketogenic diet therapies have a huge impact on gut microbiota. And in some animal models, like mice and rat models, the ketogenic diet induces an increased production in GABA through this gut microbiota. So again, another completely sort of explosive piece of knowledge that tells us that it is not only the brain changes, but also changes in your gut and in your microbiota in your gut that will produce changes that will increase the seizure threshold and protect patients against seizure. Then another really important advancement in the understanding of the mechanism of action is that ketogenic diet therapies have really powerful anti-inflammatory mechanisms of action. They block production of compounds called interleukins that are part of the inflammation process. And this is really important in the epilepsy field, because we know there's a lot of epilepsies that are highly linked to inflammation, like autoimmune epilepsies, and even some types of genetic epilepsy. So this is really important and almost like a stay tuned, because I think this is going to change our understanding of how many of how the diet works. And it leads me to think of something remarkable. When Dr. Russell Wilder started this diet 100 years ago at the Mayo Clinic, he wanted to mimic the effects of starvation. Turns out, really the effects of the diet have nothing to do, or very little to do, with starvation and to do with all these incredible mechanisms of action. But I'm just incredibly grateful that he thought of it and that we have this therapy available to us. All right, expanded uses in epilepsy. You know, of course, we, in terms of what's new in research, is also how we're using it in adolescents and in adults. So for pediatric epilepsy, very well established, the responder rate is more than 50%. So meaning, you know, more than 50% of kids that try the diet respond nicely to the diet. There's a number of papers that in research studies that have shown this. Also, we know that in adolescents, there's a small percentage of adolescents that respond, that become seizure-free on the diet, but about 30 to 40% will have a significant decrease, more than 50% decrease on the diet. Some of this has been sort of replicated in several studies. These also, the one that you're looking in your screen is from the Hopkins group, where adults had about 40 to 50% of adults have more than 50% reduction in seizures. Of course, the biggest thing with the diet in adults is compliance with the diet. And we need to find ways to improve that. Turns out adults are really good, if you're a parent of a child with epilepsy, in keeping your kid on the diet, but when it comes to us, we're horrible at staying in the diet. It has to do with the fact that we're accustomed to what we eat, and we're really set in our ways. So that's a really tough thing. But if patients stay, about 40%, 30 to 40% will have more than 50% reduction. We also know that that no matter what diet you try, there's a small percentage of patients that will be super responders and that will have more than 90% seizure reduction, meaning, you know, almost seizure freedom. So it's almost like a trial of a different medication, but again, only by changing how you eat. Before we move to expanded use of in other things like in brain tumors, I want to add that one of the most important and expanded uses of ketogenic diet in epilepsy is actually the use in status epilepticus. And I apologize, I just noticed that the slide must have not been saved, but now we know that for status, refractory and super refractory status epilepticus, the use of ketogenic diet, in addition to anti-seizure medications and or pharmacologically induced coma, improves outcome and improves the number of days that a patient needs to be on these medications. So that is something that is essentially growing. We have a trial in our center. We actually were able to publish a paper last year regarding that. The group at Hopkins has been also publishing, really remarkable data about how introducing the diet very early in status epilepticus improves outcomes. All right, so let's move forward to other innovation in regards to ketogenic diets. And one of the things we've also learned is that there's a lot of evidence that support the expanded use of ketogenic diet therapies in brain tumors. Most of these studies have been done in gliomas, specifically glioblastoma and multiforme. And GBM is a very aggressive type of cancer that can occur in the brain or in the spinal cord. GBMs form from cells called astrocytes that are sort of what support our neurons. GBMs can occur at any age, but tend to occur more in older patients. And they can cause a number of symptoms, worsening headaches, nausea, vomiting. Of course, they can cause seizures. And they can be very, very hard to treat. And, a cure is not possible. Survival shape for these tumors sometimes is really poor. So studies have suggested, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, that the cells, the abnormal cancer cells in GBM mainly consume glucose, meaning they only feed from glucose. And they really don't do well when they're fed anything else other than glucose, meaning ketone bodies, as in when a patient is on a ketogenic diet. So it's almost like you're starving the tumor, if you will. And so several studies have shown that survival is improved, for instance, in animal models, in mice, in rats, when the ketogenic diet was used in addition, so not instead, right? In addition to chemotherapy and radiation. So actually, Dr. Adriana Scheck, if you have time to look her up, Scheck, Scheck. She is at Barrow Neurological Institute, has done tremendous amount of work with this. And she's a wonderful speaker. We had her in Grand Rapids a few years ago when we had a ketogenic diet symposium. She has really done some of this work. Most importantly, recent clinical findings in humans have also demonstrated that these sustained hypoglycemia, meaning lower glucose levels in ketogenic diets, are, first of all, tolerable and can be done in patients with GBMs, and that these patients actually do better and their outcomes are better. So actually, I can share with you that some of the patients that we are seeing in our center are patients that are at the intersection of GBM and seizures, so patients that have both epilepsy and GBM, but also patients that have presented exclusively from oncology. So this is really innovative, and I will venture to say that we will continue to see expanded use of ketogenic diet therapies, not only in other brain tumors, but also in other types of cancer, if we are able to demonstrate that a lot of cancer cells don't do well without sugar in the system. There's also been a lot of innovation and research into the use of ketogenic diet in other neurological diseases. One of them, actually, migraine. And I mentioned this because, as many of you in the audience know, migraines are very frequent in patients with epilepsy. One of the things that trigger people to think about ketogenic diets for migraine is that, as you know, many anti-seizure medications are also used to treat migraines, right? As you know, valproate and topiramate are both double labeled by the FDA for epilepsy, as well as prophylaxis for migraine, but also because of the observation that many patients with epilepsy that went on ketogenic diet saw their migraines improved. And I've seen that in many of my patients. So again, it has been hypothesized that ketogenic diets are useful for migraine. It appears that these ketone bodies are protective for migraines. If you remember, I talked about inflammation. Because you reduce these levels of inflammation and the neurons are working better, that seems to improve the headaches. In limited studies have shown that ketogenic diets may reduce the migraine frequency, duration, and severity. And again, anecdotally, I have seen that in patients in our own center. Another neurological disease where we've seen an explosion in research is in Alzheimer's disease. And other types of dementia where there's changes in cognition. Turns out that it is well documented that in Alzheimer's disease, you have at baseline an abnormal glucose metabolism. The brain doesn't work as well, right? The mitochondria, remember the battery of the car doesn't work very well, and there's an increased inflammatory response. So this is exactly what ketogenic diets target. And so numerous studies have shown that ketogenic diet therapies improve cognition in Alzheimer's dementia. It also appears that ketone bodies are protective against dementia. We still need a lot more research to show that, for instance, if you have a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's, whether a ketogenic diet will protect you. I don't think we're ready to say that, but there appears to be some growing evidence that ketone bodies can protect. A lot of researchers and there's a group in Canada that has given, even if patients are not in the ketogenic diet, but if they're supplemented with external ketone bodies to their diets, they actually improve their cognitive scores in Alzheimer's disease. So I think this is a field that we're going to hear more and more and more in regards to the ketogenic diet. In a similar sort of a scenario, ketogenic diets have also, there's been a lot of research and interest in autism. There appears to be several mechanisms that play a role, including adenosine, and I share how that appears to be important also in epilepsy. Again, there's decrease in inflammation, and simply because it decreases seizures, and seizures appear to be part of the natural history of autism in many, many patients, right? So they tend to coexist in many patients. ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. There's been a lot of interest in research. As you know, this is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that can affect the upper neuron and lower motor neurons, producing eventually muscle weakness and paralysis. As you know, there's no cure so far, and it's a really tough disease to treat. And so it appears that something that happens when you break down the fats in a ketogenic diet, something called PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, are a very good source of energy for these cells that are otherwise sort of dying. They produce more energy for the cells. Remember, I said it increases the energy through the Krebs cycle. Again, inflammation decrease. We continue to see this theme about inflammation, and then increasing GABA that reduces increases sort of neuroprotection. So again, a lot of interest in ALS used in conjunction with other therapies for ALS. There's some small studies going. Whether it prolongs life or cures, again, we're not ready to say, but again, the evidence is pointing that ketogenic diet targets a lot of the mechanisms in ALS. Then, last, I want to talk a little bit about health management. There's been a lot of interest in obesity. And a lot of this interest comes from just the general population. And as you know, as I said earlier, keto now is everywhere, right? Half of your friends are probably doing one form of another of keto. A lot of patients lose weight. Research has shown that ketogenic diets are effective in losing weight. Some studies have also suggested that it is effective in managing symptoms in diabetes type 2, and that it can reverse the effects of diabetes. And it makes sense. If you have a metabolic state where you have consistently high sugar and your body's resistance to insulin, then decreasing the amount of carbohydrates is obviously going to improve that and improve your levels of, for instance, glycosylated hemoglobin. So I'm going to finish with this slide and tell you that there's a lot to learn about nutrition in epilepsy. The first thing I will tell you is that for years, I think we abandoned the concept that nutrition is critical, not just for patients with epilepsy, but for everyone, right? You know, unfortunately, we live in a society where we're on the run, a lot of times eating, you know, junk food or, you know, eating in 5 minutes. And really what we put in our bodies is really, really important. Whether or not you, as a patient or as a parent, decide to go on a ketogenic diet, I think it is critical that we recognize that healthy eating, whole nutrients, clean eating is absolutely critical. Patients with epilepsy are at risk of obesity, are at risk of sleep disorders, are at risk of migraine, are at risk of many other comorbidities. And a lot of these things will improve with clean, healthy, wholesome eating, okay? Many of the anti-seizure medications increase appetite. I know many of you know that. Many of them produce changes that increase homocysteine, which puts patients at risk of cardiovascular disease. And for years, we were sort of blinded to this concept that nutrition is so important in how we handle epilepsy. And I think that has to change. And it has to change starting with us as healthcare professionals. It has to change for you, for patients, for parents. And think of how we treat epilepsy as this 360 model where, yes, we're going to take our anti-seizure medications, but we're also going to exercise, or we're going to eat a clean, healthy, wholesome diet. And the ketogenic diet in any of its forms can be part of that plan. So I think I'm going to stop here and answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Tanner, for an excellent presentation. And we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. So I have some questions lined up, but let's go ahead and get to the questions submitted by our participants first. Let's get started. So one person says, it seems like the diet could be tried instead of medication as a first solution. Is it a different type of epilepsy that responds to meds versus diet?
So two questions, right? One is different epilepsies, and then the other one is instead?
Yeah, like,
okay. So there's two separate questions. So do different epilepsies respond differently to the diet? It appears so, although we need more research. Remember, for the first 80 or 85 years of the diet, it was exclusively used in children with really severe epilepsies. And we know that those children respond. When we look at adults, I think we need a little bit more data to answer that question. That said, preliminary studies have hinted at the fact that patients with generalized epilepsies tend to respond a little bit better, and that patients with some of the generalized symptomatic epilepsies that are now adults, like adults with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet, or just symptomatic generalized diffuse epilepsies tend to respond a little bit better. It also appears to be that there's some good synergy with the diet for patients that already have a VNS. I think they complement in terms of neuromodulation. But I think we need a little bit more research to say, you're a great candidate, you're not going to respond as well. And that's where we need more adults and adolescents willing to participate in trials to see if we can answer that question a little bit better. Now, can the ketogenic diet be tried instead of medications? It depends on the patient. We have had that scenario presented in our own clinic where patients have been, for instance, I'll give you a scenario, a patient that has been seizure-free for years on a medication, afraid to completely come off medication, but wanted to transition into the diet. That has been done. We had one patient wanted to transition to the diet, so planning for a pregnancy. I didn't talk a whole lot about pregnancy. We also don't have a lot of evidence of the effects of ketogenic diet in pregnancy. There's only 2 cases reported in the literature, so we need a little bit more research. But I think it's largely depending on the patient. I will tell you that if I see a patient that is very refractory, that has tried and failed 3 or 4 medications, would I take that patient off all seizures and try the diet alone? I probably wouldn't. But I think there's scenarios where yes, that you can try the ketogenic diet instead of medications.
And there's certainly, I can only think of one, but I think there may be a couple others, but one like GLUT1 deficiency syndrome is one where ketogenic diet is actually the treatment of choice. Are there others that you're aware of?
Absolutely, right. But I think that's a separate question, right? I mean, you're talking about when the diet is indicated as the treatment of choice, right? And that's GLUT1 treatment, absolutely. GLUT1 deficiency, ketogenic diet is the treatment of choice because in that specific disease, you don't have the enzyme that transports glucose. And so, but I feel like the question posed by the patient is, can I try that instead of medications? And so I think, yeah, that really depends on the patient. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And another question, are there any negative side effects of the diet and what should patients and families watch for?
Sure. So again, I didn't touch a lot on that because I think the purpose of the lecture was to talk more about innovation and research, but the side effects are changes in your lipid profile and cholesterol, and I'll get back with that. Constipation can be a side effect. You know, in our center, we try really hard to, you know, help patients with, include foods that have a lot of fiber. So we actually have not seen it a lot, but it can be a side effect. Gastroesophageal reflux disease like heartburn, because your diet changes, especially at first, you know, our bodies are not necessarily used to all that fat. Weight loss, which could be a bad side effect, but for many people, it's actually a really good side effect, but that could be a side effect. And then in children, you can have kidney stones. However, with adding citrates, that has usually disappeared. So those are sort of like the main ones. For the cholesterol piece or the lipid profile, what we have seen is that in what research has shown is that usually we see an initial increase in cholesterol and sometimes LDL because you're, you know, consuming a lot more fats. But within 6 months to a year, we see these levels go back to where they were before the diet was started, showing how your body sort of accustoms or get used to managing the extra fats. That said, we monitor that very, very carefully. Usually what we see again is just a slight increase in the cholesterol. Usually HDL increases your good cholesterol, which is a good thing. And triglycerides go way down because carbohydrates are the main source of triglycerides. So in general, we see a very positive change, but that could be a side effect.
Okay, great. And you actually answered the next question, which was asking about cholesterol levels. So that's great. The next person says, my daughter has been taking Depakote for almost 4 years, and she's worried about
40. I'm sorry.
4
years.
Yep, and is worried about liver damage that could cause, and would like to try the ketogenic or Atkins diet instead of medication. Is that possible? And then she says that this is she's extremely picky, and it's been worse with the increase of the dose of her medication. So how can that be handled on a ketogenic or Atkins diet?
Yeah, no, I mean, depending on your daughter's syndrome, of course you can try. I think, I mean, I think the ketogenic diet, again, research has shown that for children, 50% of kids respond. So I think it's always worth trying the ketogenic diet. A lot of times, patients on a ketogenic diet that respond really well from the get-go, you can definitely discontinue medication in children. I think kids are great candidates for ketogenic diet. And we're fortunate in the state of Michigan, we have several ketogenic diet programs for children. So I would say, give it a go. Now, picky kids. I think parents are more fearful than that they should be. Believe it or not, kids adjust. I mean, if you talk to most dietitians that deal with children, they overcome. So I would not be afraid of that. I would give it a try. Go for it.
Right, and a good dietitian is going to have a lot of experience with that and tips and suggestions,
Absolutely.
tricks and
And
things.
and the beauty of the diet is that, yes, it is somewhat restrictive, but you can make it really elaborate or you can make it on the simple, you know? It doesn't have to be this extravagant, difficult, crazy food diet. It can be relatively simple. That's how sometimes we kind of get away with it, right? I mean, like in our center, we see a lot of patients that are in group homes, that are, adults that are way pickier than your daughter, I would venture to say, and we manage, we do it. So I would say give it a try.
Great, great. So if you become seizure-free on the ketogenic diet, are you able to ever wean off and gradually introduce non-keto foods into your diet?
So, oh, is my screen still working?
Yep.
Oh, I don't see you, so I hope, okay, there you go. So yeah, so usually in children, the ketogenic diet, if kids are seizure-free after 2 years, the ketogenic diet is weaned, and kids can return to a normal diet. For adults, it's a little bit trickier. So first of all, if you have an adult that starts the ketogenic diet with or without anti-seizure medications, and that adult becomes seizure-free, it's a lot trickier because for an adult, a trial of tapering and leaving the ketogenic diet is always riskier. And with independence, driving, being able to do a lot of things, we tend to not taper them as fast. We recently sat down with a lot of other ketogenic diet centers, and we've been trying to create a consensus on how to do that. We haven't really reached a consensus on how to do that. Because again, for an adult, especially if you have failed medications and you become seizure-free with the ketogenic diet, many of us feel really, really unsure about discontinuing the diet. The good news is that it appears that staying on the diet for long-term is okay as long as you're being monitored by a dietitian and by a physician. And so, believe it or not, I mean, there's patients that have stayed on the diet for years. So I think it depends on the age of the patient. Kids tend to be able to wean off a lot faster than adults. I think if you're an adult that tries the diet and maybe this adult doesn't have full remission, then I think it's a slightly different conversation. But even patients that don't see a really big decrease in seizures, many patients really like staying in the diet because sometimes they can take less anti-seizure medication because they feel better, they have more energy, cognition improves. And so I can tell you, many of us in the field, we tend to keep the patients on the diet. As long as they don't develop bad side effects, we tend to keep them.
Right, okay. This is a pediatric question. What's the best combination, dietary-wise, I'm presuming, for an 8-year-old with ESDS, or electrical status epilepticus in sleep?
What's the best diet?
Yeah, I guess to rephrase the question, like, are you aware of any research on specifically using the ketogenic diet or its variants for electrical status epilepticus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's been well documented and it's been used. For peds, our starting point will usually be the classic ketogenic diet. But again, we have seen repeatedly that these patients also respond well to either MCT diet or even a modified Atkins diet. So again, I think it's also absolutely worth trying.
Okay. What are hospitals currently providing patients in regards to training and supporting parents of children with epilepsy as well as adults with epilepsy. So I guess, again, I'm assuming that's in reference to the diet. Is there, I guess, when you're starting the diet, I'm assuming you're getting a lot of hands-on training and support. And then probably you have periodic check-ins to kind of put that. Yeah.
So, in the pediatric centers, and I think in Michigan we have, in the east side of the state, University of Michigan has a wonderful program. I think Beaumont has a really good program. MSU has a program, Spectrum has a program for pediatric. And then adult side, Mercy Health, I think U of M is starting to do a little bit. I'm not aware of other adult programs, but so for pediatric, historically kids are admitted to the hospital, fasted for 24 hours, and then the diet is initiated. Those 3 to 5 days that the child spends in the hospital are spent doing very, very intense training and teaching for the child and for the families. And then these are followed by, within 2 weeks by a visit with dietitian and the neurologist, and then every 3 months afterwards. So yes, this would never be something that we tell you, go do keto and good luck. No, there's a very structured thing. There's a trend where we're starting to use less hospitalization, even for children. So some centers will start as an outpatient, but still you will spend a lot of time with the dietitian and the neurologist learning and training about the diet. For adults, it's the same thing. Most of us in the field, we have an initial encounter, which is almost 2 hours, so an hour and a half with the patient. Between the dietitian and the neurologist, we'll obtain a nutritional history. We review all the labs. We review the epilepsy history, the medication history, and then we do a lot of training with the patients. We provide them with a lot of information regarding what's okay to eat, what's okay, what not to eat, what's okay to eat in small quantities, fiber, label reading, recipes, meal ideas for snacks, and so forth. And then again, most of us in the field will see patients every 3 months. So 3 to 6 months. I mean, some patients are sort of coasting and they know what they're doing, then we can see them every 6 months. But I would say that universally, most ketogenic programs do spend a tremendous amount of time training the patients and going over meals, recipes, how to calculate your macronutrients, how to test for ketones. Yeah, it's not something that, again, we will tell you, try this and let us know how it goes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, are there any new foods that are like pre-packaged or already prepared so you don't have to weigh your food out?
Oh, yeah. So there's several companies that produce keto foods. So you have one category of foods which are just the liquid, already pre-prepared 4-to-1 ratio, and those are really useful for patients that are too fat. But if a patient is not too fat, they can use that as a supplement, for instance, to replace a meal or to supplement. That actually enhances adherence to the diet. And then there's another category where they have actual foods. So you can buy, like a powder that you can make into cookies or muffins or things like that. Or some companies produce just the prepackaged meals. So a lot of those services exist, some in bigger scale than others. But yeah, that can happen. The good thing about them is that if you're a busy person, like a busy parent or busy professional or whatever, it can be helpful in prepackaging a food for maybe, your lunch or something away. The caveat is that, or the, disadvantage is that they tend to be a bit expensive.
Okay, how long do you typically have to wait before you start to see positive effects of the diet? Like how long should you give it?
Yeah, so really good question. For kids, it's really fast. I mean, we see it within days. For adults, we start seeing it within weeks as well. How long to try it? For adults, I usually tell patients to try it for at least 3 months. 3 to 6 months is a good average. if you've done the diet faithfully, calculating your nutrients, doing it faithfully, and you have not seen results after 6 months, then we tend to exit the patients from the diet. That said, like I said, you know, a lot of patients like to stay even if they don't see a huge seizure response because they like how they feel, but it's usually relatively fast. These changes occur relatively fast.
Okay, great. You mentioned the anti-inflammatory effects of the diet. Are you aware of any studies or just from your own clinical experience, any use of the diet specifically for those with autoimmune epilepsies?
So yeah, and they come from the status epilepticus studies. So patients with that went into status, meaning more than 5 minutes of active seizing, or refractory status that persists after the first trial of medication, or super refractory after 24 hours. Patients that went into either of these that had any type of autoimmune encephalitis responded much better to the diet. So we're seeing a trend where, for instance, you know, like fires in children or autoimmune encephalitis in adults. I think we're seeing, and it's not a definite thing yet, we will need more studies, but we're seeing that those patients in that category will respond slightly better to ketogenic diet.
Great, great. So this is a longer question, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. Nutritionists do not do a well enough job training on how to make it work at home or with hands-on or personal experience. I'm a trained chef who has had about 6 months of serious struggle preparing food for my son, making many mistakes along the way. My previous question was in talking about how to prepare meals in bulk, how to measure foods before and after cooking, and preparing based on each family's kitchen capabilities, storage options, and general cooking capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, if specifically if you're doing cooking for a child, I'm assuming this is a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio. Yeah, I think that's actually very challenging. I think if you want to start like preparing foods, maybe cooking maybe Sunday for 3-4 days or 3-4 days in advance, I think that's really doable. This is where a really good dietitian can help you, because I know other families do that. So they prepare, you know, several pieces of chicken that then can slice and then add to like salad with smaller portions of cheese. And so definitely you can pre-do that. The key element is that for every meal that you prepare, that you weigh and measure for that individual meal. I think if you're working with a ketogenic diet center, reach out to your registered dietitian. They will be your resource to help you with that. But many families do that, definitely. Even a lot of our adult patients, especially if they're busy at home, parents or working, they would like to do some bulk cooking during the weekend and then sort of pre-package for the week.
Okay. Just for those who aren't familiar with the ketogenic diet or modified Atkins diet, can you give maybe 1 or 2 examples for each diet of just a typical meal? Like what might be included in a typical lunch or dinner?
Yeah, so let's say for a modified Atkins diet, a typical breakfast may be say like a 2-egg omelet with like spinach, mushrooms, and I don't know, peppers, and black coffee with heavy cream. Lunch can be a green salad with maybe sliced grilled chicken and some cheese on top and maybe a light dressing. And then for dinner, it could be vegetables sauteed in butter or oil with another protein, you know, maybe some meat or turkey or fish. Okay. Lots of fluids. Patients are supposed to drink in excess of 1.5 liters of fluid per day. And that could be water, broth, unsweetened tea. And then you can add fats by adding, cheese to your meals, heavy cream to the coffee, butter to saute, or to create kind of buttery sauces for your proteins. For a ketogenic diet, then for like a 3:1 or 2:1 ratio, then breakfast can be, again, eggs with bacon and some cheese. For lunch, it could be a small quantity of greens with more cheese. And again, a slightly small amount of protein with added, say, avocado. So adding, again, more fats. And then same thing for dinner, maybe oily fish with a buttery sauce and some of the vegetables, something like that. That could be an example. So again, some variations of that.
Okay, great. And I mean, particularly the modified Atkins diet, it sounds like something I would be absolutely comfortable eating. And I happen to have, many meals that kind of look like that. So it seems like it wouldn't be too huge of an adjustment for some people. So
yeah. I think one of the things that is hard for the patients to adjust is, first of all, to give up a lot of carbs, right? To give up pasta, rice, bread, candy, cereal in the morning. That's sort of like the first step. And that's sometimes really hard. The second step is to then adjust to eating, very low carbs. And really the carbs that you will eat are coming from vegetables. Vegetables do have carbs, and then we factor that in sort of understanding how much you're eating. And then the third step is to actually add fats to your diet. We're just not used to it. And so sometimes patients come back at first frustrated, I'm not reaching ketosis, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. And that could be a factor. And so we give them ideas on how to add fat, put a little bit more coconut oil, put some more slices of avocado. You can put a little bit of butter in your coffee. You can add MCT oil to your coffee. You can have, sauces made with butter and heavy cream, or you can make fat bombs, which are, recipes made with some sugar, alcohols, and fat that tastes really good, like a dessert-like, and you're adding fat. And then the third mistake that people make is that sometimes people exceed protein. And so if you remember the Atkins diet, which is sort of what was the predecessor of the modified Atkins diet, was published by Dr. Atkins, is a diet that is very low carb and high protein, moderate fat. And this is why this is a modified Atkins. And that's one of the differences, that Atkins, regular Atkins for weight loss, is actually very liberal in protein, right? And if you remember, or you had friends doing Atkins, or if you did it yourself, people were eating like this gigantic steak at night, like a porterhouse. And that's something we cannot do in this diet. And the reason is that any patient on a ketogenic diet, if the patient eats more protein that is sort of allowed, then your body takes that excess protein and converts it into sugar. Okay, it's a process known as gluconeogenesis. And it's because our body can only use so much protein per day. Excess protein is turning to sugar and then pushed into the cells. And so this is another reason why patients can sometimes don't reach a state of ketosis or don't see a good result right away. So this is, again, why you want to be, monitor, where you want to check for your ketones, where you want to be in communication with the dietitian, because these are very common errors in the diet.
Right. So as a follow-up to the sample meals that you provided, how would that change for those who are vegetarians, or probably even more tricky, vegans?
Yeah, well, so you can do a modified Atkins diet if you're a vegetarian, because you can incorporate eggs, yogurt, cheese. I think it's doable. Vegan ketogenic, I would say, is actually very, very tricky. Is it doable? I've read papers that it is, and it would be based on a lot of nuts, but I would say that that's super challenging as a vegan. I think a vegetarian, you can pull it off.
Right, and certainly of a lot of the kind of processed vegan foods, the soy burgers and things like that, they often have a lot of hidden
They
carbs.
often, exactly. I mean, if you look at like the ultimate, meat, is slightly high in carbs, and you're right. A lot of these substitutions um, are high in carbs. I think last year we had this question, Ross, if you remember, or it was during the conference in the fall. I remember talking about this and saying, yes, it's doable, but it would be an exceedingly restrictive diet. Yeah.
Right, because
vegetarian, you can pull it off because, again, as long as you can incorporate some heavy cream, some yogurt, some cheese, some eggs, I think you're good. It's doable.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Another person asks, I'm getting to where I take care of myself, but it's super hard to measure lots of different foods. It takes forever, and sometimes I don't have the time. Are there smoothie mixes that are keto friendly for my ratio, which is 3.25 to 1?
The smoothies, is that what I heard?
Yes, smoothie mixes, or
yeah,
like, again,
yeah. So again, you can there's a lot of companies that have really good mixes that are liquid or powder that you can drink, and that could be a substitution for a meal. The Charlie Foundation, they publish a book on keto smoothies. So if you go to the Charlie Foundation website, you can find it, and they're all keto, and then they're 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, and they're really delicious. So you can definitely do that. Mm-hmm. And then I also think Cambrook Pharmaceutical produces, I think there's some also products that you can mix and make a smoothie, or like a pudding type thing. That would be 2.5 to 3, or even 4 to 1 ratio. So yeah, there's alternatives. Yeah.
Great. Is there any evidence that kind of a casual approach to ketogenic tendencies, I guess, like where you would simply reduce carbohydrates and add more fat, but not necessarily establish ketosis? Is there any evidence to suggest that that would help with epilepsy, even if you're not, again, formally doing one of those diets?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is where, for instance, a low glycemic index treatment diet kind of works. And this is how some of my own patients have approached it, where for them, maybe a modified Atkins is too restrictive and difficult to kind of measure. Then my advice is absolutely do more of a low glycemic index. And essentially what a low glycemic index is exactly what you're talking about, Ross. So you're eating less carbohydrates than you usually do. You're eating carbohydrates that have very low glycemic index. I think that's absolutely fine. And I think part of the consensus that we're working on for all ketogenic groups in the United States is, I think we're all asking ourselves that question. Can some of you start the diet on your own and do kind of like a lighter version? And possibly, yes. I go back to my final slide. And I think at the end of the day, what we eat is so important. And so as long as you're eating healthy, wholesome foods, ditch all the highly nasty processed sugars out there, I think you'll see improvement. Absolutely.
Right. And kind of to that leads into like the last question that I wanted to ask, which is, I know there's been very little research on specific, or to suggest that any kind of specific nutrients or foods have either a beneficial effect for seizure control or a negative effect for seizure control beyond the ketogenic diet, of course. But we have a lot of people who will say, oh, I've stopped eating artificial sweeteners, or I've stopped with MSG, or I've stopped, things with red dye in them, and so people, I've heard anecdotally a lot of people say that they've made changes in their diet related to specific nutrients or added specific nutrients that helped. I guess, is there any research to back up anything on that really, or is
not so much. But to me, what I'm hearing is essentially is reducing highly processed foods, right? Which is what I tell all my patients, keto or not. We should not be eating highly processed foods. This is not helpful or healthy for anyone. So what a lot of these diets have in common, interestingly enough, for patients, for instance, with autism, there's a lot of these in the autism world. What a lot of these patients have in common is that these are clean diets. And something that a keto diet forces you to do is to eat clean. You cannot eat something highly processed on a ketogenic diet because it's going to be loaded with nasty sugar and a lot of, bad sweeteners. I mean, we tell patients that it's okay to, from time to time, use, if they want to use like stevia, which is plant-based, it's okay. But a lot of these other sweeteners are probably not good. So I have a lot of patients that use like paleo in keto, which is a match made like in heaven, and it's fine. Again, what all these diets have in common, all of it is no processed foods, no sodas. We should not be drinking sodas or prepackaged, highly processed foods that are high in these refined sugars that now we know, by the way, are super inflammatory for our bodies.
Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, again, there's probably some information out there on actual dietary supplements or specific vitamins or minerals and the potential impact on seizure control. But from what I've seen, it's generally been largely inconclusive. Is there anything that maybe that's promising in terms of either vitamins or mineral supplements?
No,
that maybe we have more research that would.
Yeah, so something that we're looking at is a ketogenic diet on a pill, and so adding either pre-made ketones or adding something that mimics the state of ketogenic diet, and that's very preliminary. But that might be something that we would use, which would be good because again, going on a very restrictive diet can be very challenging for many adults. But for specific like supplements, I don't think we have anything firm that we can say that definitely improves.
Okay. All right. So we are about out of time, and it looks like we've run out of questions. So that was a great discussion, and I'm glad we had so much time for the Q&A because we covered a lot of ground there and had a lot of participation. So thank you so much, Dr. Tanner, for an excellent discussion.